Hello everyone and welcome back to Let's Play Blaster Master 2. In the last part, we went through stages 3 and 4, and now we're in what's probably my least favorite stage of the game, period, stage 5. And the thing that makes this stage annoying doesn't really start coming into play until a little later on. And by that I mean, namely, the mini-boss is partnered with the latter half of the stage, but it's also the return of our good old friend Water. Water in this portion of the stage is not instant kill. In fact, I don't think it's instant kill in this stage, period. Unless maybe if you fall into it with like Jason alone, then it might do some damage, but to be frank, in this portion of the stage, I don't think I've ever fallen into the water. Because compared to, say, the lava or the waterfall in an earlier stage, it's a lot harder in my eyes to fall into the water here. Also, I don't know exactly what, but every time I've heard this particular music track, it reminds me of something else. I want to say it was a Game Boy Advanced game, or it was either something else on the Genesis or Super Nintendo, probably just given the relative similarities in some of how their sound stuff is handled, although the GBA I don't think had a dedicated sound chip, it just had bad speakers or something like that. The GBA was kind of a mess, looking back on the technical side of things. Just especially that screen. Ugh. With that said, we do get to the first mini-boss here pretty quickly, and I don't like either of the boss fights here in Stage 5, because they're underwater, and Jason does have a higher but very slow jump in comparison. The boss fight is a giant fish that moves up and down vertically throughout the stage, and whenever it gets perpendicular with you, it charges forward. It has a little bit of an acceleration curve, but like with other bosses, the more damage you do, the faster it starts to move. There is a slight timing you can do with the fight where if you time your jump specifically and then start falling in such a way and then hold left or right depending on what side of the stage you're on, you can generally avoid getting hit, but the thing has a much bigger hitbox than the actual sprite is, so getting hit here is very easy to do, and it also does a lot of damage to you, especially harder to dodge as you do more damage, and it does get faster. These fights just feel like they needed more time to cook, honestly. Again, being able to use sub-weapons in these stages could help. But no, you can only, for some reason, use Jason's sub-weapons in the actual, like, Sofia sections one as Jason, which is not the place I feel you should be able to use them, like I brought up last part. Additionally, again, they really should have given them to you earlier in the game because they're kind of useless at the point you get them. Ow. Now, something I can't quite recall with some of the later stages is some of them, I think more or less once per stage moving forward, we're going to get a sub-weapon from one boss per world for standalone Jason. And I don't remember if you actively need to get them. I think you need to in at least one instance because it opens a door or something. But you can largely ignore a lot of these fights, I think. I never do because I have completionist tendencies, but oh well. And for beating this mini-boss, we get the homing missile for Jason. Admittedly, out of all the sub-weapons that he could have gotten, this is the best one, but that's just because homing missiles are always pretty good. I always willingly take the fall damage there because I'd rather come down along the bottom route because I feel it's easier to avoid getting hit by certain things on this route. Just be careful not to fall down there. Plus, there's also free health right here, which is pretty good. I want to say some of the item drops that are just on the floor respawn every now and then. Namely, I want to say it's after a death or entering a door for, say, a mini-boss. I know that you can use that to some extent to farm lives back in like stage 1 or 2. No, actually, no, it is stage 2. It's after the second tank fight. You can go into that hidden wall and just grab some stuff over and over again just by going back in and out of the room, I believe. Not that there's much reason to, because at that point, things move pretty slowly. Plus, I want to say there might be a max life count in this game, but I'm not entirely certain because I never really go to grind. Also, I should note, I believe I made a bit of a misnomer back in part 1. I stated at the start of the game that I selected the credits, those were my lives. No, they're not. Those are your continues. You get between 2 to 6 continues, so 2 to 6 game overs before you have to start all over again. And admittedly, even on the lower continue count, it's pretty, at least by this generation of gaming standards, easy to get to the end of the game without getting a true complete start over, game over, because I feel they give a decent amount of health and lives just playing in the stages and exploring around a bit. But due to the damage ratios at the same time, I would still recommend, if you're new to the game, choose 6 continues just to be safe. And something I'm kind of glad has really gone by the wayside over the years is just having to start all over in the game. Usually there's some form of a save system, unless it's like a roguelite or roguelike, as it is, period. Also, be careful of the fish enemies here, because you can only damage them from behind. In fact, there's going to be a couple enemies you can only destroy from one direction moving forward in the game. With that said, speaking of fish, it's time for the second boss fight. Did you like that first boss fight against a fish? Because it's time to fight that thing again. Only has, I think, a bit more HP. And the biggest difference is whenever it starts to move towards you, it spawns out a little baby fish. I want to say it spawns more and more the more damage you do to it. This thing can be a little more annoying because of that. Admittedly, the direction they spawn out in is a little bit weird, because I want to say they try to home in on where you were when it starts to move. But even then, as you can see, sometimes they don't always come out, because, to be frank, sometimes I think you accidentally shoot them when they're spawning. Yeah, see, look, now it's spawning 2, and eventually starts spawning, I think, 3. Also, a valid strategy for both of these mini-bosses is shooting down to the right of them. At the same time, though, I feel sometimes you just don't hit the hitbox for some reason. I think sometimes they want you to shoot it straight on. And with how they gave Jason 8-way aiming, that feels really uncomfortable. And it's weird. Because that is something I like that they did in this game. They didn't have to give Jason 8-way aiming. For the era, it would have been very typical to just give you the 4 cardinal directions, and that was it. Games like Super Metroid and Gunstar Heroes were... Oh, no, even Contra gave you diagonal aiming. So, there were a lot of good games that gave you 8-directional aiming. A lot of the bad ones didn't, though. And it sucked. Of course, some of those games that gave you 8-directional aiming made up for it by being also intensely difficult games. Looking at you, Contra 3. But that's a different topic altogether. They definitely tend to design things that you can handle, but tend to is the key word there. With that said, for beating this mini-boss, we get one of the power-ups that, to me, shows another instance of this game potentially being rushed. We get the Sophia's dive upgrade, which in the other games acts more or less as 8-directional movement underwater, and even changed the design of the Sophia. In this, while the item looks like it's a unique form for the Sophia, all it does for the Sophia when you're playing is increase your jump height. Your controls no longer feel like they're truly underwater. And it's awkward. Because I honestly feel the 8-directional movement would have helped better with dodging some of the enemies they're going to have moving ahead of us. Now, this last third or so of the stage is where it really starts to fall apart in my eyes, because we're going to have a lot of mines and a lot of the fishes we can only destroy from one direction spawning ahead of us in really cramped hallways that it's kind of hard to control yourself in. Because, and partially it's because of how slow the mines and the fishes move compared to you now that you have the dive upgrade. I feel they really should have made it so that the dive upgrade was more so what it was in Blaster Master 1, and even all the later Blaster Masters that had it, really, where it just made you more mobile, not just made your control feel normal. Because now you're partially, gonna psychologically overcompensate, but also your movement doesn't make sense in comparison to that around you. Also, the homing missiles do not know how to deal with the fish for some reason, because their hitbox, I guess, is only on half of it, so it's starting to detect it, but also trying to not detect it. It's weird. I like this part of the song, though. I like this. I guess that's drums. Now, the latter portion of the stage also has a lot of cramped tunnels, like I mentioned before, and the annoying thing about them that they try to do is make it a bit more of a maze, like the top-down sections with Sophia, in that 2 of the 3 options you'll get in most cases are dead ends that sometimes have health or a power-up in them, but only one of them is the way forward, and I get, again, it's trying them to have a bit more of an open level design so they could say in some regards it's close to what the original game was. Yeah, I suppose, at least. But for what they're doing, it just does not work. Also, it's really easy to just take some shots from the fish to get through the power-ups. This is probably the most awkward jump in the stage right here, and I just completely ignore it. Because, hey, I know there's health right there. Thankfully, though, while we have to deal with water for a lot of that stage, and note, again, you don't get damaged by it, so really inconsistent with the earlier stages there, the top-down section has no water in it whatsoever. Feels something that would have helped the game feel a bit more diverse, as well as different stage music for the top-down segments. Or at least, like, a different mix of the song we were already listening to. Kind of like the comparison here, admittedly sticking with Sega. The Sonic CD past, present, future mixes of the same song, at least in the Japanese soundtrack, less so in the US soundtrack, where only 2 of the songs were the same thing, because they kept the past music the same for some reason. Because that would have made this feel more mechanically separate. Also, yeah, I know that I could see that bullet coming from a mile away, but also controlling this here is a little bit awkward. Because the awkward thing about the control in this segment, I don't think I've really covered yet, is while yes, you do press, in my instance, I have it customized to be A and C to rotate the tank's cannon around clockwise or counterclockwise. The movement for the Sofia is very momentum-based, where you start slow and then accelerate. And sometimes because of that, making tight corners is a task. As your momentum is either going to carry you into the wall, past where you wanted to go and into a wall, or into where you go and then bounce off the wall back into what you were trying to dodge. And I guess what they want you to do, I guess, keyword here, is go slow. But for how the game is otherwise, I feel going slow is a mistake, because enemies, admittedly, have a bit of an unfair advantage compared to you, because I think while you can shoot them off screen and they can shoot you off screen, they'll detect you a lot before they can see you, or before you can see them, rather. Because I think they're always somewhat aware of where you are, as long as they're an enemy who can track onto you. But that said, the advantage you have is that if you get closer to them, your rate of fire gets so ridiculous because you have a maximum amount of shots allowed on screen at a time that you can just mow down anything. Especially if you have the shot rate up. Now I am the Toho. Oh, that's right, I don't think I've mentioned those yet. Sometimes in the stage you'll find question mark power-ups. They are entirely random. They could be health ups, they could be the negative shot rate or speed downs. I like that they kind of make you go for them in certain instances, though, because it at least makes the stage feel like it has some amount of flavor rather than being the same mechanics as it was back in Stage 1. With that said, now we are moving on to Stage 6. This is probably my favorite stage in the game, at least in terms of the music. It's my least favorite stage in the game in another regard, in that this is the least original stage in the game. More on why as we progress, though you might notice the tile set already seems a little bit familiar. Admittedly, though, this is also where you can start going a little hug wild with your sub-weapons in my eyes, as you should have enough saved up at this point, and your ammo's probably maxed up as well, that you can just spam them and kill most enemies in one shot, or you can just spam this shield power-up, which I believe I mentioned what it does earlier in the game. It's complete invincibility. With that said, it's easily the rarest sub-weapon not only to drop from enemies, but to find in the stages, so you want to really save it for the latter half of the game, where they start getting a little more, let's say, generous with the amount of enemies they place around. I also find the first boss of the stage real quick, and it quickly becomes obvious why this is one of my least favorite stages in the game. It reuses the bosses from Stage 1. We got the worm, and we're going to have the bee again later on. They have slightly more HP, and I think they start moving a little bit faster than they did in their first fights back in Stage 1, but it's the exact same fight. Why? I mean, to an extent, it is a little bit of a tradition, I suppose, because every Blaster Master game reuses boss fights. Even the first one makes you fight Crabulus like twice, the frog boss I think twice. But in a game that's already smaller in scale than the others, it really seems distracting. With that said, for beating the worm again, we get the jetpack for Jason, which uses the exact same fuel meter as the jetpack for the Sofia. With that said, it does share the exact same control problems where you accelerate as you fly further and further up. And because of that, you need to kind of liberally tap the button to avoid not only overshooting your destination, but also to avoid letting go of the button too early and falling down. Because if you fall while using the jetpack, fall damage still applies. So you need to make sure you're just tapping that button liberally enough that you don't just fall straight down on your ass, explode, and die instantly. Like, look, even that was far enough to fall. Like, why? Ugh, that's dumb. Time for the bee again. But that said, the bee doesn't get to stick around too long, because I generally feel this is also a shorter boss fight, because I think it's a little less erratic in its movements than the first one. Or it could also be the fact that now we have a better gun, now that I think about it. Although, no, we got the Crusher before the first bee, didn't we? I'm just wrong, aren't I? Probably. And we get 2 items for beating this one. We get the 3-way shot and a key. The key opens a door in this stage. The 3-way shot, it's the 3-way shot sub-weapon for Jason. Also, the background glitches. This might be a BizHawk issue, though. I don't think this happens on the cartridge. I say I think because footage I've seen of people playing it doesn't happen. That's the weird thing about emulation. We're getting close to things being completely faithful and running true to the system, especially because we're getting to the point where FPGAs and emulating the system at the hardware level is becoming more commonplace with stuff like the Mister. But sometimes you're still going to have weird issues like this, just caused by A, differences in technology, and B, games being programmed weirdly, or poorly, or a combination. With that said, though, Stage 6 is also the first stage in the game that's very short, because we're already onto the top-down segment, and this is probably the most back-and-forth top-down segment in the game, because the exit, I think, is, like, right behind us, technically. We gotta go around the entire stage, though, because, oh, boy. I do like this color palette, though, for this stage. I don't know why. It reminds me of Zelda 2. I think it might be because one of the US version temples had a color palette like this. But I haven't played Zelda 2 in a hot minute. I think it's been... If it hasn't been since the Let's Play I did of that years ago, which probably isn't too good anymore, it's probably been at least since a year after that. Because I believe I mentioned this on content in some form before. I know I have on my streams. I tend to play one Zelda game every year. Doesn't matter which one it is, just to play a Zelda. Usually I do it over like the summer or winter breaks just to play one. Like last year I played Minish Cap. This year I'm probably going to end up finally retouching Skyward Sword in some regard or something. I'll figure it out. It's always a very spur-of-the-moment decision, although the usually happening on vacation limits me because it usually means I'm playing one of the handheld ones, like the Oracle Duology again, or Link's Awakening again. Who knows, by the time this comes out, we might finally have a release day on the Breath of the Wild sequel, because for the recording clarity's sake, it is currently January 12th, 2022. New Year's off to a good start so far, I'd say. Oh, also, these Caterpillar mechs are annoying for another reason. As you can see, their shots bounce around. And they always do bounce off at a 45-degree angle to where they land from. The problem is they bounce around so much, it's very easy for them to just worm their way into a place you feel you're completely safe in and just get cheap-shotted. But that's at least in some cases they do place a good amount of power-ups around to help you get through things a bit smoother. But with that, I'm about to need to end this off here. Thank you guys for watching, and in part 4, we're gonna go finish off the game. Oh, last second death. That's just absolutely rude. See you guys then.